Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shift Book Club Live. I'm writer and broadcaster Sam Baker, and I'm delighted to be here with the author of our August Book Club pick, Wifedom, Anna Funder. Anna is the author of the international bestsellers Stasiland and All That I Am. Almost 2 decades ago, Stasiland, Stories from Behind the Berlin Wall, won the Samuel Johnson Prize. It has been published in 28 countries, been adapted for radio and stage, and is now a modern classic. No pressure, Anna. All That I Am is a novel set in 1930s Berlin, and that won the Miles Franklin Prize. In her new book, Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life, Anna examines the life and work of Eileen O'Shaughnessy, the woman behind the writer who is George Orwell. Through an ingenious mix of historical research, biography, and fiction techniques, she recreates the Orwell's marriage from 1936 to 1945 to bring Eileen into the light and to ask what it takes to be a writer and what it means to be a wife. And as I was just saying to Anna, slightly made me feel a little bit different about George Orwell, but we will talk about that in a minute. And actually, I'd love to know how those of you who've finished it. Oh yeah, and by the way, if you haven't finished it, can you just pop a message in chat just so I know if anybody is like, I haven't read it. Wifedom was published last month. It's an instant Sunday Times bestseller and has been described as wonderful by Antonia Fraser, who's no slouch herself, brilliant by Claire Tomerlin, also no slouch, and marvelous by Tom Hanks, who I couldn't help wondering, does he have an eye on the film rights, Anna?
I wish, not as far as I know, no.
Oh well, I'm sure we'll talk about the film rights later. Anyway, welcome and thank you so much for being here from Sydney. We really appreciate your time. So can you let's start by maybe tell me about the summer of peak overload that led you to discover Eileen.
Yeah, so I described this at the beginning of the book, where I just found myself, we had been living in New York City and moved back to Sydney. And it was one of those times of just sort of caesura, really, where things were changing. My husband went and got a big job to keep us all going, because my writing is kind of intermittently, we're intermittently broke, really.
Yeah. Yeah, the life of a writer isn't that lucrative, is it? Let's face it.
But it left me then with two teenagers and a preteen, and then I added a depressed French exchange student into the mix. And it was that of peak kind of overload where you're getting the kids back to school, and my daughters were going to 2 different new schools, and I had a film script for All That I Am that I had to review and deadlines, and the nanny had a car crash, which is not in the book, but it was okay. We were lucky to have. And I just found myself having a kind of perimenopausal meltdown in the shopping mall as I pushed a trolley around and dragged the poor French exchange student around, and just thought, what has happened to my life, and how did all this work come to be mine? And instead of doing something useful or healthy like yoga or taking something, I turned to Orwell because he's so good at how power works and who it works on from an underdog's point of view. Or that's what I still think that, and that's what I thought. So I read my way through Orwell, and then I read the 6 biographies, the main biographies of him, all written by men. They came out between the early 70s and 2003. But when that was done, I wasn't cured. So I kept reading, and I came across these 6 letters from Eileen O'Shaughnessy, his first wife, to her best friend from their time at Oxford together when they both read English. And Eileen and George had been living for almost 6 months after they got married in a tiny cottage in a village called Wallington. I think it's 30 miles out of London. That cottage was really primitive and kind of decrepit. It had no electricity and 1 tap and an outdoor loo, which I imagine was quite common, loo. But she had been making meals and looking after animals and growing vegetables for them to eat, and he had been writing. And So at the end of that year, which was 1936, they went to stay with his parents in South Wold. And I just actually visited South Wold on my UK tour and visited this house that she wrote the letter in, which was completely thrilling to me. But she writes this letter to Nora, her best friend, and she writes, "Dear Nora, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to write to you, but we have quarreled so continuously and really bitterly since the wedding that I thought I'd just write one letter to everyone once the murder or separation was accomplished." And she's so hilarious and so clever. But I just thought, what have you been quarreling about in these early months of wifedom? Why do you want to kill him, even in jest? And I went back to the biographies and I looked up their accounts of these newlywed months, and there are variations on this theme. The newlywed months for Orwell were idyllic. Conditions were perfect for him. He was never happier before or after. And I just thought, wow, in between this passive voice of the disappearing her work, so in between his idyllic conditions and the woman who's no doubt making them, maybe there's room for a book. I say that like I knew what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. But I reading, and I just wanted to find her from under all of this erasure, really, in the biographies and then in history.
It's just astonishing, isn't it? The gap between her going, I want to kill him or leave him, and him being in heaven because he can just, while away his days with his muse, or someone else does all the legwork. It's just, I mean, it's not a surprise, but it is enraging. I just want to go, obviously I want to talk a lot more about Eileen, but before that, I just want to go back a little bit because you turned to Orwell in the first instance, and then you read all of his work, and then you read all the biographies. You must have been looking for something.
That's a very good question. I must have been looking for something I didn't find. Maybe. But really, there was enormous pleasure in reading his work, his essays in particular, and then Animal Farm in 1984, which are the best novels. And there's great pleasure in reading the biographies because you see him reflected slightly differently in each of them. And I think I just wanted to stay with him. And I thought, until I discovered Eileen, who was making all these conditions, I really found him to be like his writing voice is, which is funny and very self-deprecating and very acute and cranky in all the right ways politically. So there was just, I was probably looking for something, but also there was just enormous pleasure in that reading itself.
So have you always been a bit of a completist?
I think I'd probably be flattering myself if I thought of myself as a completist. I do probably take things a bit far.
When you were reading all the biographies, did you start to become, I mean, did you already know about Eileen? Did you start to become aware of, I don't know, an absence, like something in between the lines that wasn't being said?
No, the erasure is really swift and dirty. It's sly. So if you read that conditions were idyllic for him, it didn't strike me, even as a feminist writer, to think who was making the conditions. It would now, I've taught myself to read under the passive voice. Or if the visas were obtained, or if the baby was collected, or the court proceeding went well, all of these very important, dramatic, sometimes life-saving or life-acquiring or organizing things that were done, it really didn't occur to me. So I think I was not reading against the grain or not enough to be looking for her at all.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I hadn't really, until I was, reading Wifedom and then listening to a couple of interviews with you, I hadn't really thought about the impact of the passive voice and how completely erasing that is, because it's not dismissal, it's not, it's not sidelining, it's actually, you're just actually not there.
I know. So that was really the main, when I sort of eventually figured that out, that was a real key. And every time I read something in the passive voice, I became alert. There's a part, you can read all of Homage to Catalonia, for instance, Orwell's account of fighting in the Civil War in Spain in 1936-7. And I'd read it twice and loved it, but you don't really realize that Eileen is there almost the whole time. And you certainly wouldn't realize that she was working in the political headquarters of the party that Orwell was fighting with, nor that she was working in propaganda and supply and communication, or that she came under fire in the city and he ran the other way, or that she saved his life by fronting up to the prefecture of police, which was very dangerous when there were Stalinist raids going on, to try and get the stamps in their passports to get them out, which she successfully did. So you read Homage to Catalonia, you've got no idea she's there. Eventually, when I was finishing Wifedom, I'm not very electronic, I read on paper, but I pulled up the text to Homage to Catalonia on screen electronically because it's out of copyright. And you can look it up on Gutenberg.com. And I just searched for my wife in that book, and it comes up 37 times. So 37 times he has to mention her, but he never once mentions her name. And that's another way of erasing someone. If you don't name the person who does all of this, she never has to come alive in the book. She never has to be a character with attributes or agency because she has no name. So that's a kind of extreme way of erasing someone, is never to name them in the whole book. A book that she informed because he was off in the trenches and she was at the epicenter of this political battle, and that she later typed and edited. So the ironies kind of compound. They're really incredible.
It's just like the idea. It's almost like the typing it up as the final insult, because she must have been thinking, you what? This isn't my experience of it. And do you think then that actually the biographers were continuing the erasure rather than enacting it?
Yes, I think that in the case of Homage to Catalonia, certainly, but there were sources that they could have found if they had been interested in finding out what Eileen, once you know she's in Spain and you know she's working at the headquarters of the National Labour Party, which is affiliated with the coup that Orwell is fighting for, you would perhaps be interested to know what she was doing there. And it wasn't really very hard to find out. So I read all these biographies and then I went to their footnotes and I found the sources and I read them. And, she worked for an American economist called Charles Orr, who was writing the propaganda of the party. And she supplied all the men at the front with what they needed. She had her sister-in-law driver, who was a doctor in London, drive a car full of medical supplies over to Barcelona. She lent the big boss, John McNair, money because he was broke, as was the whole party. And she dealt with all the communications to and from the trenches. So she really was central. And her boss, Charles Orr, wrote an account of her, which was available and would have been available if they had looked for it, where he said, compared to all the grifters and chancers and political operatives and spies who came through our office, Eileen was a superior person. And that's something that no biographer uses, or it doesn't prompt them to wonder what she was doing. Um, Eileen herself said of George later that she called him George, the name he wants to be called, though his real name was Eric Blair. And she said of him, George, in writing to a friend, George has a remarkable political simplicity. And one of the biographers just changed that. That was clearly too much for him. And he just changed it to read, Eileen said, George has a remarkable political sympathy. So if you look hard enough, you can find all these extraordinary things and bring her back into history, really, or into.
Because when I was reading Wifedom, I mean, I did keep thinking, how do you know all of this? How did you discover all of this? And she was clearly so invisible, but it was all there under the surface. You just had to look, and nobody had bothered to look.
Apart from her letters, so it was all there. If you're reading Wifedom, you just, hopefully just read it through. But it does have 40 pages of notes at the end.
Yeah.
And each page. So any page that you're on, you can look up in the notes where all of the quotes come from, which biographer or which source or which friend of Eileen's or which girlfriend or ex-girlfriend of Orwell said what about it, And most of those things were there to be found. I'm not a professional researcher or anything like that, so my skills are not particularly fantastic, and I found all of these things. Sometimes it was in the archive of the biographer themselves. You can access online Sir Bernard Crick, one of the biographer's archive. It's called the Crick Archive. And in that, for instance, one of Orwell's girlfriends who knew him very well, a woman who actually her whole life refused to sleep with him, said, well, his attitude to women, of course, that was because he was a sadist. So Crick doesn't use that because it's just, I think, too much. And I understand, I have some sympathy for that. It's quite hard to make a coherent picture of a man who you are sort of in love with if you're his biographer or even his reader, and then kind of work the sadism into the book. But if you look at 1984, which is a deeply sadistic, misogynistic, violent book and vision, the fact that he was thought to be a sadist by someone who knew him very well, and she wasn't the only one, might be interesting because that's the man from whom the vision comes. But in answer to your question properly, these 6 letters that Eileen wrote to Nora date from the murder or separation letter right at the beginning of the relationship, to the end of the relationship in 1945. And the biographers didn't have the benefit of that because they only came to light in 2005. So, I've got permission to use them, was very, very lucky. So I can make scenes in which she's writing them because I know where she was when she wrote them, and I know what she's not telling her best friend, like Orwell's off with someone else or whatever it is she's not saying, she's ill or and the letters are sort of by turn funny, tragic, fascinating, insightful, and all of those things. So yeah, it's only fair to say they didn't have them. What use they would have made of them, having already erased her, I'm not sure.
Well, I'll say for you, my instinct is that they just would have just pretended they hadn't seen them. I mean, I know that when you write a biography, you often have got your angle and your agenda, but it's really, I'm still kind of, because I read it when we booked you for the book club, and then I actually listened to the audiobook yesterday, and I'm still reeling really that, that there's such a, and I think this is obviously the case with probably the whole of history, because there's 2 sides to every story, but that something can be so different, the received wisdom. You kind of entered this project as is the right word, fan? Certainly as somebody who had a deep appreciation of Orwell and his work. How do you feel about him now?
I think that his work is still just as wonderful. You know, I'm not reading it right now because I'm just endlessly talking, but I'm sure that I will reread it. The essays in particular, and from 1984. And I also think that we live in an age of rising authoritarianism and tyranny everywhere in so many countries. And in an age of blanket surveillance, you know, like we effectively had what Orwell called in 1984 a telescreen in our pockets at all times. So I think that his vision and insights into writing and into politics and power are really important and should definitely still be read. In Australia, I know they're on school lists. My kids have studied both books. Whether one would want to live with him is another. But the other thing that's interesting about that is to, in a sort of broad brush way, I think when we read a book or watch a favorite movie or a favorite actor or look at a painting by a grand 20th century painter like Picasso, say, or someone, we want to imagine that the creator of the work is somehow as great as the work. And so then you end up with these fictions about, I'm talking about men here, the great artistic geniuses of the 20th century. You end up, so in Orwell's case, he was very concerned with decency, by which he meant integrity being the same inside and out, and also in some kind of really, I find quite sad ways, he meant heterosexual as well. For him, he was a virulent homophobe, but he really, his most important relationships and possibly sexual relationships were also with men. That's very kind of murky. So he felt, I think, decency was important because he was worried about it in himself. And that's the same for many, many creative people, not about decency, but about the fact that an artist will pull from themselves a vision of something quite dark, or insights that are difficult, and put them into a film or a book or a picture in a way that is more than palatable, that makes a strong artwork. But it's sort of wrong and in a way naive to want the artist to be a sort of vanilla, stand-up, decent, everyman kind of guy, much as Orwell himself would have wanted to be. You know, when I lived in New York, I went to hear a really beloved writer of mine, Richard Ford, speak, and he said something that made sense of this dilemma for me. He said to this audience, I feel always when readers meet me that I'm a disappointment. And I put my best self into my work, and I am not my best work. And I just think it's a much more fruitful terrain to look at who an artist really is in connection with their work, rather than have a fantasy of them as something that they wanted to be but were not.
There is an ongoing conversation, isn't there, at the moment about the kind of can you love the work and despise the person, effectively, now going back through people like Picasso, but also more contemporary writers. Where do you stand on that? I mean, have you consigned your Woody Allen films, DVDs to the bin, or can you separate those two things?
Well, I actually, when I watch Woody Allen, I have not watched Woody Allen for some time, but I think that's it's contradictory. I think that Woody Allen is doing a similar thing. So, without wanting to libel him in any way, if you look at many films, he is interested in relationships with very young women, and he's interested in relationships with I don't know, is it the wife's sister in Hannah and Her Sisters, or, you know, in some, in kind of illicit relationships that wouldn't be condoned, including with very young women. And that's the direction in which his life has gone. So the fact that it appalls or surprises us that he went that way, when clearly in his films he's signaling that that's where his interests are, in where is the moment of transgression in his desire to be with a much younger, out of bounds young woman. So in a way, I feel that he has revealed himself to be what he was always trying to look at in his artwork. So I guess it's a bit connected with Orwell, say, as a slightly paranoid, sadistic man with violent fantasies, who's a misogynist and produces a book like 1984, which is all of those things. You know, early on in 1984, Winston fantasizes about raping a woman and slitting her throat at the moment of climax. The fact that that book is given to 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds everywhere in the world to read without necessarily a comment on that misogyny is more interesting, you know, that, or that we all inhaled Woody Allen films without really wondering what that said, perhaps, about Woody Allen. And then we all act surprised when that turns out to be the man that made those movies. So in the case of Orwell, I can separate it a bit better because I am a writer and I love the writing, and I enormously flawed myself, and I kind of have sympathy for it. The sort of ogling of Mariel Hemingway, I can't really do anymore. So it's inconsistent.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think, oh God, my brain just flatlined. Sorry, it does. Menopause, it does that. At the beginning, you were talking about the kind of mental, domestic, emotional load that led you into this book. What is your own experience of wifedom?
Well, I have to say this is one of the ironies or of this, is that I have a husband who is, you know, deeply supportive in every way, kind of financial, emotional, psychological, in the house, with the kids and so on. And he says as a joke, well, you couldn't have written this book without me. But he's absolutely right. I couldn't have. And one of the things that I explore in the book is, this may not be the case for every writer, and I hope that it isn't, but I do think that writers often have a kind of wobbly center. You know, I need a lot of support in so many ways. I think it's partly from working alone every day all the time, partly from trying to nut out things that are difficult, partly because writing just is hard. So, you know, I'm no picnic to live with, and I've had enormous support, which is something I really need to put front and center. But I do think that the world, you know, we all live in patriarchy. As far as we know, there is no other place. And the world divides up the work of life and love in the domestic sphere so that it is gendered. So actually, to talk about the term decent, for instance, just to go back to that, you can be a decent man without doing any work. That's a term that reflects on your moral qualities. But you can't really be a decent woman or a decent mother or a decent wife without doing the work. And that is to show that those terms have work associated with them, work for families, children. And I guess that was a zone of invisibility that I recognized in my life and the life of my friends, many of whom are white and privileged like me. So I was really interested to explore that. And actually the statistics just bear it out. I mean, I don't know what the gender pay gap is in the UK, but here it's enormous. And women everywhere have less power, less money, less leisure time than men. So that is because they're doing other things which are unpaid and largely invisible, supporting the world as we know it. And I guess that was something that I really liked.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because this conversation, as I'm sure the people who are listening will be thinking, is something that comes up literally every single time I speak to someone. And it's not because I'm obsessed with it, because I am actually, it's like you, pretty lucky with, well, I shouldn't say lucky, like my partner and I, between us, kind of do everything. And his son who lived with us is long gone. So, there's not that. But every time I speak to someone for the podcast or for the book club, this issue of the unsung, overlooked, sidelined, dismissed labor of women, be it the cooking and cleaning and childcare, or be it the buying, remembering the birthdays, or, buying the Christmas present, all of those things. It comes up every single time. And I spoke to someone last week for an upcoming episode, and she doesn't have children, and she put it really brilliantly. And she said, the thing is, it doesn't matter whether there are children in the equation. Somebody has to be the mam. She's Northern, obviously. Somebody has to be the mam. And I just thought, you know what, you're absolutely right. But why is that 99 times out of 100 a woman?
It's because it comes by definition in patriarchy. The thing comes with doing all of this work in the interests of men, so they have more money, power, and leisure.
Yeah.
I think it's definitional. And I think that we don't really talk about it because it goes so much to the definition of what it is to be a good or decent person, female. It's very hard to unpack, to not do it and still feel that you are generous or that you are good in some moral way. So that attachment of work to the definition of being a good woman is really fundamental and almost unspeakable. We all talk about the actual unbalanced load, but why that's there and how that got there also needs to be spoken about really clearly, because if you can see those things, you can share them better.
Yeah, and I think it's in the fact that one says that you say, oh, I'm lucky. It's like, no, you're not lucky. That's just like, that's kind of how it should be. But this year particularly, there are so many books that from one direction or another kind of address this subject, whether it's from the point of view of the women behind and big writers, or whether it's books about emotional labor or domestic labor in a more specific way. Do you think there's something in the water, that there's change afoot, or do you just think it's like a trend and it will come and go?
I don't really know what it is, but I think it's necessary. And it might be that we have had more than 100 years of feminism. So Orwell's mother and Aunt Nellie, to whom he was really close, were feminists and suffragettes. And his Aunt Nellie got herself arrested with the Pankhursts and went to prison. He ran a literary salon in London with luminaries of the day like H.G. Wells and Chesterton and Nesbit. She was an Esperantist. She was interested in sex roles. She didn't get married till late in her 50s or early 60s to a man she'd been living with for a long time. So these were women who, he was raised by women they were also Fabians. So they were left-wing feminists. But you don't know, I'm definitely going to get to your question. I'm just thinking of this now.
No, it's fun. It's interesting.
You don't understand that from the biographies, because the biographers trace Orwell's line through the male line, through the Blairs. And his father, to whom he wasn't close, was not particularly interesting or interested. He was a low-level civil servant in the empire in Burma, and his only interests were golf and the cinema on Saturdays. So the fact that this writer comes out of a household of intellectual left-wing feminist women, when you see him and he grows into an intellectual left-wing man who sees things from an underdog point of view, that female inheritance is so interesting and crucial that it's completely overlooked. But I'm getting sidetracked. Your question is, so that's early 20th century feminism. My mother was a second wave so-called feminist in the 1970s, and here we are in 2023. And I think some of this examining of unpaid labor, emotional labor, invisibility of women, along with the statistics around gender pay gap and all of that, is because perhaps we expected, we women generally, to be further along. We expected that the changes that came around in the 60s and 70s. So my mother, I was born in 66. When she married, her pay went down to half, I think. Her pay went down to half that of a man. And when she got pregnant, she had to stop work. So things have changed a lot in 56 years, but not enough. And we are now dealing with this very deep kernel of patriarchal entitlement and women's invisible labor. Perhaps because in kind of privileged Western countries and some others, some of the other more grotesque legal impediments to women's participation in society have been managed.
I mean, that's kind of a narrative that was fed to our mothers and fed to us. I mean, what are the kind of conversations that you have with your daughters and in fact your son?
Yes, so my daughters are now 21, 19 next week, and my son is 14. They came of age, my daughters came of age during Me Too, and that's also when I started writing Wifedom, was in 2017. So they have a language to talk about these things, and among other things, in a way that I just didn't in the 80s and 90s. It didn't exist. And I think that's a wonderful thing. You know, one of my daughters told me that she had this boyfriend who was really lovely, and the boyfriend was talking to her about mansplaining. And eventually my daughter said to her boyfriend, "Look, so-and-so his name, are you mansplaining to me?"
Yeah.
And we didn't even have around those sorts of things, let alone all of these revelations of Weinstein and Epstein and pussy grabbing in the White House and rape in Parliament House here in Australia, allegedly, and so on and so forth. So they are more aware of these things. And I think if something happened to them in the street or the workplace or a party or a pub, they would expect to be listened to. And I think that quite possibly, hopefully, I don't know this for sure, the burden of shame, which traditionally resides with the woman who is assaulted, is perhaps shifting more to the man who is doing the assaulting. Not that we have seen that play out in better convictions for rape or sexual assault. So these things are all in flux, but I'm very hopeful for my children, all of them.
There's a question from Nicola, which actually kind of relates back to what we were just talking about, and the books addressing this. But it's also it's kind of consistent with if you do an event. I mean, I don't know, were your events attended? Was there a mix, or was it predominantly women? Sorry, I'm getting to the point, Nicola. Sorry.
Interesting question. I did a 10-city tour of Australia and many, many events, and there were definitely many more women than men in the audience. And a lot of the response was around the feminist issues, around these sorts of ideas and thinking. And I've just come back from the UK, where I was in London and Edinburgh, Bath, Canterbury, Southwold, and I had a wonderful time. And the audiences were more mixed. There were more men, and the focus was rather more on Orwell, which I suppose you might expect. You know, it's his home turf and so on, as well as on Eileen and the aspects of it. So yeah, it varied. I don't know what that says about Australia, and maybe a kind of machismo that exists here. You know, there was a lot of kind of indrawing of breath and kind of involuntary kind of clapping and stuff in some bits of the discussions. And I don't know, a bit that, yes, it was slightly different in each case.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think the kind of the point Nicola makes, and I think you know, I definitely agree with, is that if, you know, diversity events are only attended by women or people of color or LGBTQ plus people, or and books addressing the issue are only read by women, or then you just end up in a loop, don't you? It's just like, it's like the way that it feels to me that patriarchy is pushing back against Me Too, you know, very hard in America, you know, but also here and other places. They just kind of, don't know where I'm going with that really, but it's like, if the conversation is only between women, then it's not going to change, is it? But we have to hope our sons will.
Yeah, I think that I know exactly what you're saying. I think that this has that I've sort of slightly escaped that, because Orwell is so beloved by so many men. So many men have read this and written to me really beautiful letters, kind of a bit shocked and appalled, really. And I've been very moved by that response. So I think that perhaps this book is just slightly benefits from the fact that Orwell is just, so many men love him that they also have to read this, or feel they have to read this, and then are astonished at this omission and astonished at some of his behavior, because we do want to think he's decent and wonderful, and he's wonderful in some ways, but deeply indecent in others.
And Nicola is asking, have you had any pushback from Orwell fans who just don't want to acknowledge this side of him?
I think I have. For a long time, I wasn't reading the reviews, but I've read most of them now. I haven't in that forum, but I do suspect I've had a couple of really bizarre emails, or a few, because I'm reachable through my website. I don't read them, and I think in the comment sections under reviews there've probably been quite a few things as well. But I don't need that in my head, you know, so I don't read it.
No, and never go below the line, ever. You might, you know, the chances of you seeing anything that will enhance your life is pretty slim, I think. I've got a couple of questions that are kind of slightly linked. There's Elaine. Oh, sorry, Di said, it's not a question, but I absolutely love the expression conditions of production in the book.
Well, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? Everybody's conditions of production. So I'm talking about mine, which are made by Craig, his is made by me. Eileen made Orwell's. You know, we are all so reliant on one another in this work.
Who made Eileen's?
She had to make her own, exactly.
Oh, poor Eileen.
Well, I think she was enormously intelligent, and she had a pretty clear-eyed view of Orwell. And they wrote Animal Farm effectively together. So he wanted to write an essay critical of Stalin, and she had worked at the Department of Censorship in the Ministry of Information in London, in Senate House during the war. And it was still during the war. And so she knew what would be published and what wouldn't, and had these excellent political instincts, and said, no one is going to publish an essay critical of Stalin right now because he's helping us win the war against him. So they turned it into a novel. And Animal Farm is this complete outlier in all of his works and has this voice of whimsy and his ensemble cast of characters. And she'd studied at Oxford under Tolkien, so she knew about fable structure and so on. And he wrote each day. She went to support them financially by working in the Ministry of Food. But I have to say the biographers downplay the fact that she worked to support them financially as well for years. And then she would come home and they worked on it together in bed each night. And she would go back into the Ministry of Food and tell all her colleagues about the latest installment and kind of go over it. And she knew it was a winner. So she had a lot of satisfaction in this. And towards the end of her relationship, one of her letters, she says that she thinks she could make some money from home, as it were. And I interpret that as saying she's going to write her own books. So that didn't happen. She I think she thought she could do it all, make his conditions of production and do his work and make his work better and do everything. But eventually her health just wore down. And I don't think she had quite enough support. I mean, everybody needs a lot. And she probably needs.
Yeah, one of the things that really, is so powerful in the book when she's died and he's just basically looking for a replacement, like it's a job ad or something. And when you say no one would take it, because I'm paraphrasing, because the incumbent had died of overwork and neglect. It's like, oh my God, that's so, so powerful. Right, sorry, Elaine's question. I completely forgot to ask you about your use of fictionalization in the book, which is really, really powerful. And Elaine is saying that kind of using added stage directions, it's a really powerful way of bringing Eileen to life. So what was it? I know you used this technique in Stasiland as well, didn't you? What was it that inspired you to use that approach and blend it with memoir and biography rather than a traditional approach?
So Stasiland is actually straight nonfiction. And I had to write it as nonfiction because those accounts of the poor people who resisted that surveillance regime were so extraordinary, their courage was so extraordinary that it wouldn't have been credible in the novel, and neither would that surveillance regime. So that's really straight nonfiction. This book is clearly demarcated into a kind of narrative, biographical, feminist memoir that is nonfiction, and that's set wide on the page. And then these scenes in which Eileen writes the 6 letters to Nora and a few other scenes and a few other letters are from her point of view, and they're set narrow, so you know immediately that you're in fictional scene. But her real letters are used in those scenes, so they're in italics. So that is really clear. I think what I wanted to do was, I could have written a novel about Eileen, but it would have privileged my voice really and kind of devoured this brilliant woman as material for purposes of my own, novelistic purposes of my own. And I wanted her to come back to life in her own words in these letters. But I also wanted to show these sly ways in which she has been written out of history, first by him, and then I took these 6 biographers as representative of how that happens. And then I wanted to show how women in general, even today, are invisible in the work that they do. I'm guilty of it myself. I say things like, we organised Christmas lunch or the holiday or the school camp or whatever it is. We is me, that's a sort of generalising thing that we do. I wanted to show all of the ways in which these methods of eliding or disappearing women in their work are still at work today. So that's why it has a non-fiction contemporary part, and then there's fiction. When I talk about it, I have to say it sounds like a complete dog's breakfast, but I hope it doesn't.
Oh, a structural challenge for you, I think, more than anything else. I mean, how did you approach that? Did you write through? Did you write the separate bits and stick them all together like a great big jigsaw? How did you approach it?
I wrote it through. So the book is, it takes you through Eileen's life and Orwell's life, their early life. There's a little bit on that. There's how I came to write it. There's a bit on me too, which is the perspective that I'm taking through the book. Then there's their early life. And then basically this book is an account of a marriage. You know, that's the guts of it. The marriage out of which Animal Farm came and George Orwell, the writer, was made. And so I took each letter. The letters date from, as I said, the beginning of the marriage to the end in 1945. And they are so beautiful in themselves that I was able to make a portrait of that marriage from heaven to the letters. So, and then in between, if something occurs to me that speaks to now, then I'll put a bit in about that reflects back on it. So, you know, there's a page where I have a good friend who used to go out with, when 30-something years ago, with a rock star, and she's a very she's a trained lawyer, like I was, and she's very accomplished woman. And she said to me, you know, there was something about being with him, about being his sidekick, that was pleasurable to her. And it was like being in the slipstream of him. And so I put that in because I am wondering whether Eileen felt something pleasurable about being in the slipstream of Orwell, even though when she met him, he was a nobody, and she had no idea who he was, and you know, she wasn't taking any credit for making him who he became. But I just look at those pleasures that women have who are attached to great men or so-called great men. So sometimes there's a small bit like that that is looking at that and trying to bring it into the present tense so that we can think about it now.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And we haven't really unfortunately got time to pursue this. But as you were saying that, I was just thinking that when a man is attached to a great woman, on the whole, the assumption is that he is, I can't think of the right word, so I'm going to say defanged, demasculated. You know, that if there is, but when a woman is, in the case of Eileen, creates Orwell, because like you say, Orwell, she wasn't in Orwell's slipstream because Orwell wasn't Orwell until he met Eileen. So even now, the assumption is that a woman gets something from being with a great man, but a man is only emasculated by being with a great woman, which is...
Yes, find a very great man to be with a great woman.
No, I agree. I've got a little question tangential to that from Della before we wrap up. Della isn't able to be here. She said that, we've talked about the fact that many of Orwell's biographers downplay Eileen's role in his life. They don't really downplay it at all. They just completely ignore it. But arguably because it doesn't suit their narrative. How did you manage to ensure that you didn't do the same in your work?
So that question is about downplaying Eileen, do you think? Or downplaying
No, I think the question is about how in redressing Eileen's role, you didn't downplay anybody else. But I don't know who you would be downplaying except for George. And frankly, he can take it.
I think it's a good question. I hope that I'm understanding it correctly. I was concerned to be fair to everybody in the book, including George. But I'm not sure that it reads like that, because a lot of the information about George was put into footnotes or by the biographers, or doubted, or just left out. So accounts of him by other women who he, in the biographers, euphemism, pounced on, or quote unquote attempted violently to make love to, in part, or the fact that he wanted Eileen to know that he was being unfaithful, that he pounced on, actually stuck his tongue down the throat of one of the closest friends who came to visit him in the TB sanatorium. So he's ill with TB, and he forcefully kisses Eileen's best friend, and then he tries to sort of tell Eileen that that's what he's done. So all of these things are true, and they're all left out because they were so difficult to include and make a coherent picture of a decent man. So when you see them all together, it is very confronting. But, you know, it's all true and it's all there. If you wanted to read the biographer's accounts, they are all there. And I suppose Wifedom is, I was picking up scraps off their cutting room floor of the women themselves and their accounts of him, and other people's accounts of him too that were left out when they were too difficult, but mostly they were women, because the women knew him best, and saw him closest, and putting them out there for everyone to read, so that Wifedom should really sit alongside the other biographies in order to make a picture of a much more complex man. But I wasn't repeating necessarily all of the things in those biographies. That wasn't possible. So in that way, I suppose it's a particular view. It's a woman's view of Orwell, and it's Eileen's view, and it's other women's view of Orwell. So all of that is true, but all of it is also somehow strangely feels new because of the way it's been left out.
That's perfect. So, you know, you've written, fiction aside, you know, Stasiland was a massive hit, modern classic, and I don't doubt that this will go on to be the same. So no pressure, but what next?
You know, the parts that I was, when I was writing Eileen's voice, partly because she's so, I mean, I can't match it. She's so witty and so whimsical and so hilarious. And then very kind of direct and moving as well. Writing those fictional parts was the easiest and most thrilling part of this book. So I have to admit, I have said this before, but I am really hoping to write a short novel which involves no research, and it's pure pleasure. And my husband thinks that's very unlikely, but I will be writing a novel, and cross your fingers for me.
Well, good luck. And like I said, no pressure, but I'm sure that I can't wait to read it, and I'm sure lots of other people can. Thank you, Anna, so much for your time. Thank you for making time from us, from Sydney, and it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been great to see you here. I didn't expect to see anyone. I thought it was just me and Anna, so this is great. Thank you.
And I'm sorry about this blurry screen because of my crazy paintwork in my study. But, yeah, thanks for having me.
Not at all. Thank you. Bye.